Percy Bysshe Shelley. Percy Bysshe Shelley, radical in every aspect of his life and thought, emerged from a solidly conservative background. His ancestors had been Sussex aristocrats since early in the 17th century, 1600s. His grandfather, Sir Bysshe Shelley, made himself the richest man in Horsham, Sussex. His father, Timothy Shelley, was a hard-headed and conventional member of Parliament. Percy Shelley was in line for a baronetcy and, as befitted his station, was sent to be educated at Eton and Oxford. As a youth he was slight of build, eccentric in manner, and unskilled in sports or fighting, and, as a consequence, was mercilessly bullied by older and stronger boys. He later said that he saw the petty tyranny of schoolmasters and schoolmates as representative of man's general inhumanity to man, and dedicated his life to a war against injustice and oppression. As he described the experience in the dedication to Leon and Cythna, "So without shame I spake, I will be wise and just and free and mild, if in me lies such power, for I grow weary to behold the selfish and the strong still tyrannize without reproach or check. I then controlled my tears, my heart grew calm, and I was meek and bold." At Oxford in the autumn of 1810, Shelley's closest friend was Thomas Jefferson Hogg, a self-centered, self-confident young man who shared Shelley's love of philosophy and scorn of orthodoxy. The two collaborated on a pamphlet, The Necessity of Atheism, which claimed that God's existence cannot be proved on empirical grounds, and, provocatively, they mailed it to the bishops and heads of the colleges at Oxford. Shelley refused to repudiate the document and, to his shock and grief, was peremptorily expelled, terminating a university career that had lasted only 6 months. This event opened a breach between Shelley and his father that widened over the years. Shelley went to London, where he took up the cause of Harriet Westbrook, the pretty and warm-hearted daughter of a well-to-do tavern keeper, whose father, Shelley wrote to Hogg, has persecuted her in a most horrible way by endeavoring to compel her to go to school. Harriet threw herself on Shelley's protection, and gratitude and admiration, he wrote, all demand that I shall love her forever. He eloped with Harriet to Edinburgh and married her, against his conviction that marriage was a tyrannical and degrading social institution. He was then 18 years of age, his bride 16. The couple moved restlessly from place to place, living on a small allowance granted reluctantly by their families. In February 1812, accompanied by Harriet's sister Eliza, they traveled to Dublin to distribute Shelley's Address to the Irish People, and otherwise take part in the movement for Catholic emancipation and for the amelioration of that oppressed and poverty-stricken people. Back in London, Shelley became a disciple of the radical social philosopher William Godwin, author of the Inquiry Concerning Political Justice. In 1813, he printed privately his first important work, Queen Mab, a long poem set in the fantastic frame of the journey of a disembodied soul through space, to whom the fairy Mab reveals in visions the woeful past, the dreadful present, and a utopian future. Announcing that there is no God, Mab decries institutional religion and codified morality as the roots of social evil, prophesying that all institutions will wither away and humanity will return to its natural condition of goodness and felicity. In the following spring, Shelley, who had drifted apart from Harriet, fell in love with the beautiful Mary Wollstonecraft Godwin, daughter of Mary Wollstonecraft and William Godwin. Convinced that cohabitation without love is immoral, he abandoned Harriet, fled to France with Mary, taking along his stepsister Claire Clairmont, and, in accordance with his belief in non-exclusive love, invited Harriet to come live with them in the relationship of a sister. Shelley's elopement with Mary outraged her father, despite the facts that his own views of marriage had been no less radical than Shelley's, and that Shelley, himself in financial difficulties, had earlier taken over Godwin's very substantial debts. When he returned to London, Shelley found that the general public, his family, and most of his friends regarded him as not only an atheist and a revolutionary, but also a gross immoralist. When 2 years later Harriet, pregnant by an unknown lover, drowned herself in a fit of despair, the courts denied Shelley the custody of their 2 children. His first child with Mary Godwin, a girl born prematurely, had died earlier, only 12 days after her birth in February 1815. Percy and Mary married in December 1816, and in spring 1818 they moved to Italy. Thereafter he envisioned himself as an alien and outcast, rejected by the human race to whose welfare he had dedicated his powers and his life. In Italy he resumed his restless way of life, evading the people to whom he owed money by moving from town to town and house to house. His health was usually bad. Although the death of his grandfather in 1815 had provided a substantial income, he dissipated so much of it by his warm-hearted but imprudent support of William Godwin, Leigh Hunt, and other needy acquaintances that he was constantly short of funds. Within 9 months, in 1818 to 1819, both Clara and William, the children Mary had borne in 1815 and 1817, died. Grief over these deaths destroyed the earlier harmony of the Shelleys' marriage. The birth in November 1819 of another son, Percy Florence, their only child to survive to adulthood, was not enough to mend the rift. In these circumstances, close to despair and knowing that he almost entirely lacked an audience, Shelley wrote his greatest works. In 1819 he completed Prometheus Unbound and a tragedy, The Cenci. He wrote also numerous lyric poems, a visionary call for a proletarian revolution, The Mask of Anarchy, a witty satire on Wordsworth, Peter Bell III, and a penetrating political essay, a philosophical view of reform. His works of the next 2 years include A Defense of Poetry, Pisidion, a rhapsodic vision of love as a spiritual union beyond earthly limits, Adonais, his elegy on the death of Keats, and Hellas, a lyrical drama evoked by the Greek war for liberation from the Turks. In these writings, unlike the early Queen Mab, are the products of a mind chastened by tragic experience, deepened by philosophical speculation, and stored with the harvest of his reading, which Shelley carried on, as his friend Hogg said, in season and out of season, at table, in bed, and especially during a walk, until he became one of the most erudite of poets. His delight in scientific discoveries and speculations continued, but his earlier zest for Gothic terrors and the social theories of the radical 18th century, 1700s, optimists, gave way to an absorption in Greek tragedy, Milton's Paradise Lost, and the Bible. Although he did not give up his hopes for a millennial future, he wore a ring with the motto, El buon tempo verrà, the good time will come. He now attributed the evils of society to humanity's own moral failures, and grounded the possibility of radical social reform on a reform of the moral and imaginative faculties through the redeeming power of love. Though often represented as a simple-minded doctrinaire, Shelley in fact possessed a complex and energetically inquisitive intelligence that never halted at a fixed mental position. His writings reflect stages in a ceaseless exploration. The poems of Shelley's maturity also show the influence of his study of Plato and the Neoplatonists. Shelley found congenial the Platonic division of the cosmos into 2 worlds, the ordinary world of change, mortality, evil, and suffering, and an ideal world of perfect and eternal forms, of which the world of sense experience is only a distant and illusory reflection. The earlier interpretations of Shelley as a downright Platonic idealist, however, have been drastically modified by modern investigations of his reading and writings. He was a close student of British empiricist philosophy, which limits knowledge to valid reasoning on what is given in sense experience, and within this tradition, he felt a special affinity to the radical skepticism of David Hume. A number of Shelley's works, such as Mont Blanc, express his view of the narrow limits of what human beings can know with certainty, and exemplify his refusal to let his hopes harden into a philosophical or religious creed. To what has been called the skeptical idealism of the mature Shelley, hope in a redemption from present social ills is not an intellectual certainty, but a moral obligation. Despair is self-fulfilling. We must continue to hope because, by keeping open the possibility of a better future, hope releases the imaginative and creative powers that are the only means of achieving that end. When in 1820 the Shelleys settled finally at Pisa, he came closer to finding contentment than at any other time in his adult life. A group of friends, Shelley's Pisan circle, gathered around them, including for a while Lord Byron and the swashbuckling young Cornishman Edward Trelawney. Chief in Shelley's affections were Edward Williams, a retired lieutenant of a cavalry regiment serving in India, and his charming common-law wife, Jane, with whom Shelley became infatuated and to whom he addressed some of his best lyrics and verse letters. The end came suddenly, and in a way prefigured uncannily in the last stanza of Adonais, in which he had described his spirit as a ship driven by a violent storm out into the dark unknown. On July 8, 1822, Shelley and Edward Williams were sailing their open boat, the Don Juan, on the Gulf of Spezia. A violent squall swamped the boat. When several days later the bodies were washed ashore, they were cremated, and Shelley's ashes were buried in the Protestant cemetery at Rome, near the graves of John Keats and William Shelley, the poet's younger son. Both Shelley's character and his poetry have been the subject of violently contradictory, and often partisan, estimates. His actions according to his deep convictions often led to disastrous consequences for himself and those near him, and even recent scholars, while repudiating the vicious attacks by Shelley's contemporaries, attribute some of those actions to a self-assured egotism that masked itself as idealism. Yet Byron, who knew Shelley intimately and did not pay moral compliments lightly, wrote to his publisher John Murray, in response to attacks on Shelley at the time of his death, "You are all brutally mistaken about Shelley, who was, without exception, the best and least selfish man I ever knew." Shelley's politics, vilified during his lifetime, made him a literary hero to later political radicals, the Chartists in the middle of the 19th century, 1800s, Marx and Engels at the end, and for much of the 20th century, 1900s, many of the guiding lights of the British Labour Party. As a poet, Shelley was greatly admired by Robert Browning, Swinburne, and other Victorians, but in the mid-20th century, mid-1900s, he was repeatedly charged with intellectual and emotional immaturity, shoddy workmanship, and incoherent imagery by influential writers such as F.R. Leavis and his followers in Britain and the new critics in America. More recently, however, many sympathetic studies have revealed the coherent intellectual understructure of his poems and have confirmed Wordsworth's early recognition that Shelley is one of the best artists of us all, I mean in workmanship of style. Shelley, it has become clear, greatly expanded the metrical and stanzaic resources of English versification. His poems exhibit a broad range of voices, from the high but ordered passion of Ode to the West Wind, through the heroic dignity of the utterances of Prometheus, to the approximation of what is inexpressible in the description of Asia's transfiguration, and in the visionary conclusion of Adonais. Most surprising, for a poet who almost entirely lacked an audience, is the urbanity, the assured command of the tone and language of a cultivated man of the world, exemplified in passages that Shelley wrote all through his mature career, and especially in the lyrics and verse letters that he composed during the last year of his life.